Welcome back. I am excited about part 2 of our evening. For those who don't know me, I'm Dana Mitchell, and I'm the current president of Westminster event today. And I thank you for spending your evening with us. Today's lecture and fireside chat is a collaboration between these three organizations. And we're committed to elevating conversations and topics that are important to us as citizens of this world. After today's fireside chat and lecture, I've got a special announcement, so please stay until the end. How about that for a tease? But I want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Anansi Wilson is going to speak to us about Dred Scott to George Floyd. How did we get here and how do we move forward? Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Wilson. He's an associate professor of law and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Black Life. And they are an award-winning scholar of law, literature, and cultural studies and racial justice strategies, and an author of creative nonfiction. Their legal research is situated in legal philosophy, critical theory, political economy, and constitutional law. Their writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. This is going to be a good night. Dr. Wilson will be joined after the presentation by our very own Kevin Lindsay. Kevin Lindsay serves as the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center and an organization whose vision is to create a just society that is curious, connected, and compassionate. Kevin is a widely respected public policy advocate and lawyer, and he is the previous commissioner for the Department of Human Rights. He's been honored by I can't tell you how many people, and we don't have enough time tonight to go through it all. But let me just say that we really are in for a treat tonight. We're going to start the evening with a lecture by Dr. Wilson. What I'd like to tell you is Dr. Wilson really bookended our Black History Month. He wrote a powerful essay on Black history as U.S. history, and then he concludes our Black history programming tonight with his lecture. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Wilson to the podium. Thank you.
Everyone for being here on this evening. So what I would like to do is have this lecture not necessarily be your old school law professor lecture where I'm just drowning on and on, but the idea is to kind of ground us all in this contextual moment in history and this moment in Black life, and also in this moment of legal precedent. So stay with me. At some moments it might sound like a poem, and other moments it might sound like a sermon, but I promise you I am not your mother's pastor. So let's get into this. We are standing, sitting, ancestors, captive, land, and as remnants of stolen land and stolen bodies and stolen dreams and stolen children and stolen futures and stolen our law and our law makers. We are reminded that Black history is a history, one of carrying on anyhow, anyway, anytime, one of beautiful resilience. In the face of hopeless violence and loss, it is one of unspeakable love. Black, but once present, is often, always, already criminalized. Marked as in and outside of law, inside insofar as we are always already reachable by its disciplinary arms, but outside of law, insofar as we are beyond the grasp of the protective shield of fundamental and statutory rights, our bid with the high serving of the day's version of the whip and the noose. But how did we get here? It has been 223 years since Dred Scott was born. 186 years since he was brought to Fort Snelling, national landmark and place of leisure, a budding Minnehaha, where carefree folks walk and relieve their pleasure, the labor and the service of other Army officers on this free land, this confiscated territory, this land held by the. It has been 166 years since the Supreme Court refused to rule that Black people could have standing. You see, that is to say, they refused to say that Black people could be seen in the eyes of justice, could be cognizable by the law, and provided remedy for harms. That would require a recognition that Black people are people and not property adorned with flesh. And instead, he ruled and stated, African Americans had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an identical relation and was bound to respect. And that the Negro, for his own benefit, he was bought and sold and treated as ordinary article of merchandise and traffic. Whenever a profit could be years, and this opinion has never been explicitly or other ways to die. We are running out of ways to say, stop killing us. We are running out of ways to request, demand, plead, or demonstrate for drinkable water and livable homes. We are running out of ways to make separate but unequal a thing of the past. We are running out of ways to protect our children from bullets. We are running out of ways to birth children safely. We are running out of ways to survive in food deserts. We are running out of ways to evade and avoid police contacts, never mind search, seizure, terror, or lynching. We are running out of ways to make fortresses out of moldy, hurricane-struck and dilapidated homes. We are running out of ways to make ways out of no ways. We are out of ways to live in the wake of an always already looming death. We are running out of ways to draw ourselves into this American daydream turned nightmare on Black streets. We are running out of ways to convince ourselves and our children that the arc of history bends anywhere or any way besides white over Black, white over Black, white over Black. We are running out of ways to run and make sense out of no sense. We are running out of time for solutions. America is running out of time to think differently about the Black and Black letter law and how Black life is rendered furtive and strictly scrutinized always already. Under law and all too common communal white supremacist gaze, African Americans and other Black people in America continue to exist in the wake and contend with these afterlives of slavery. This is not to say that we are in the identical position of our ancestors, but instead that we inhabit a similar relational floor and struggle against the remnants of its logics and its power structures, particularly legal, but also social, political, and economic. These operate as bulwarks against the completion of full emancipation. For us, emancipation has been a long, anemic, and never-ending sojourn, one that is often captive and at a standstill or pushed into a cyclical retreat. While the Civil War ended most of chattel slavery and ushered in the Reconstruction Amendments, it was followed by a white lash marked by an epidemic of lynching and anti-Black white supremacist racists like Rosewood and the Tulsa Massacre. This was accented by the Black codes, those laws regulating Black movements, Black stillness, Black speech, and legal pleadings, followed by Jim and Jane Crow, explicit and implicit racially subordinating laws, and more lynching, more burning, more 30-second trials and jury deliberations, punctuated by lynchings and barbecues, by penectomies and mastectomies, and bodies set ablaze under the cover of law. When Jim and Jane began to fall, racial and racial sexual profiling became innovative technologies of subordination and othering, providing handy public logics or reasons for surveillance, search, and seizure. Black people have been rendered inherently furtive. That is to say, of a sly or suspect character, or alternatively, the living manifestation of criminal, violent, or corrupt intent and coming action. This was before the Fellows Papers, to ensure and assure that Black history and presence, queer histories and presence, are contorted in a way that supports a social order hell-bent on returning us to our needs. The Civil War was not about slavery, they say. Slavery was not about race, they say, but instead states' rights and consequences of Northern aggression. Yet this argument, this rhetorical device, could not pass the reasonable person standard, a test that is often used to make sense of the stillbirth of the Black right to privacy. Now we are revisited by states' rights to ban history, to ban discussion, to ban bodily autonomy, and ban simply being. When these questions of state power to subordinate arise, we must always ask ourselves, the state power to do what? To whom? To what end? We must ask these questions of book bans, always and forever, to ban or revise history. As our Jewish brothers and sisters remind us, we must never forget. We must always remember to recall, lest we find ourselves in the hell our ancestors labored to escape. Some unsuccessfully, others with scars so deep they escape the human eye. This is why we must know our history. This is why we must plant new seeds. This is why we must bear good witness. This is why we must stand in the truth of our present, our past, and the real challenges of the future, so that we can help midwife and birth a better future for the children who come next. As John Lewis might say, we are in an era that demands good trouble, and it is time we get to work. We must not forget where we've been, nor can we forget the hope that has sustained us over the centuries, that has shaded us despite the bright lights of anti-Black racism, that inspires us even now to cling to life, even when there are times when watching a man be lynched on national television for 9 minutes, begging for life, for breath, and for his mother. Even then we clung to each other. We persisted, we resisted. We rose and we summoned the will to never forget who we were before those chains, who we were despite those chains, who we could be together because of those chains or badges or bullets or laws or precedents or other obstacles that refuse to make sense out of freedom. This work continues, coming together anew again. This time for the time for labor is now. History is our shield and our sword of truth, and our tether to powers and strength bequeathed by those who came before us. We must never forget, lest we become lost in the narratives thrust upon us, internally or externally by state and political powers that be. We are the ones that we have been waiting for, and we bear witness as lawyers and social engineers of a just society laying in wait, to map a new path toward healing, transformative justice, and sustainable, thriving human life. Education nor money are silver bullets. They would not solve anti-Blackness or white supremacy or transphobia or sexism. They're not the solution, but we are. We must summon and come to be a space where ideas can be challenged and remade into democratic tools that unlock and free the minds, bodies, and passions of all of those that share this earth with us. We must create spaces to allow students and community members and lawmakers to learn with and alongside each other to retrace and recreate a human ethic. We must closely retrace the Black life in Black letter law to understand how law operates as the public logic of power, and rethink how that power can be democratized and used to undergird living and thriving as opposed to struggling and dying. We must enter into a value-based space where Black lives and queer lives and poor lives not only matter, but operate in all their diversity as the very justice, the masquerade or guiding light of the American Hamilton or parasite on society. Which one are you? Each of us here must decide, will you consume or will you build a new world? So now it's time for some dialogue. Thank you all. Get to sit with the boss.
How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Are these on? I think so.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well, first off, I'd like everyone just to give another round of applause for such a fantastic. You gave us a lot to think about, and I guess to start, this idea for the students in the room, social engineers or parasites. So within this, what charge do you give your students as a professor there? I think you have a couple in the audience. And then what would you give as a charge to the students that are here in the audience when they're about this role that they could play as social engineer? Because sometimes it's limiting, and we think sometimes you can only do that in the public space, but are there other ways in which we can do that?
Yeah, so I think the social engineer quote is something that my students probably get tired of hearing at the beginning of class every semester. Uh, it is kind of my go-to. But I also say I usually assign the article by James Baldwin, The Creative Process. And in this article, Baldwin encourages us all to take a step away from our social duties, our day-to-day life, and have a little separation to look in the mirror. Right. And unfortunately, in this piece, you're using it in a sustainable way. This is how you're not uplifting human life. And so I think for all of us, we have to look beyond whatever our profession is and ask, are you sustaining the lives of the least among you? Right? Or are you profiting from them? Because usually it's not as complicated of an answer as we would like it to be, right? We can look at our taxes. We can look at the pain that is caused by our profession and answer that question very seriously. And I think sometimes it's a very, very rude awakening. So I think for me, I try to go with the Maya Angelou quote and, that where she said, my goal in life, right, is not merely to survive, but to thrive with passion, compassion.
There's no doubt that you're living with style tonight.
Try to make my partner proud.
There we go. I'm reminded of a quote from Baldwin, given what you just said, this idea that it's because I love America so much, I have the right to criticize it. You gave some powerful criticism tonight. How can we as lawyers, as individuals seeking to bring change, live into what you're doing and then what Baldwin encouraged us to do?
Well, I think we have to tell the truth, right? I think all of us that have been to law school sat through our first constitutional law class, and for the lack of better terms, our first thought was, what the hell? Right? You knew what the Fourth Amendment was, or at least you thought you did, right? And then you start going through criminal procedure and like, wait, a reasonable person standard. Wait, it would have been reasonable for me to run, right? And I think that when we go through law school, we just repeat the rule. We memorize the rule, we apply the rule, we repeat the rule, and we say, when I get out of here, I'm gonna do something different. But what happens is then we study for the bar exam and we try to master the rule. But what happens is now the rules have mastered us. Right. And we refuse and we forget to kind of push forward and have those open critiques about the hypocrisy of the law and the kind of cognitive dissonance that really exists within it, or even the history of knowing that the law is written in a time where Black people are not considered human. We're not a part of the lawmaking process, and that's never remedied. So I think what we have to do is have a very serious conversation, that we have a social contract that we never consented to. And then what does it mean to be forced to assent to that?
I appreciate it. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll go to the audience for questions. You asked us to push back and not fall into the trap, and you gave a couple of points there I just want to highlight. You talked about the difficulty of overturning Dred Scott, and I think some of us who have been looking is that doesn't seem to be all that troublesome to the Supreme Court on certain issues. And then I think also pushing back on this construct as to Civil War. Did it not change sort of how the law should be interpreted? Again, seems comical to think that the war did not, but yet there is a lot of legal precedent suggesting to the contrary.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's so much going on there. I mean, we can look at the kind of, not just the kind of white lash to the Reconstruction Amendments, right? But the way the Supreme Court went after the first Civil Rights Act and said, wait a minute, this is too broad. You have no right to regulate race, right? You have no right to kind of confer these particular types of rights upon Black people. And then even we look at, the 14th or 15th Amendment, we have our Supreme Court saying, and Clarence, we have Clarence saying, having this kind of ideology about privileges and immunities, that these only applied to people who are descendants of slaves. What is going on here, right? And so our Supreme Court is bipolar insofar as our rights are not stable, but they're consistent insofar as never, ever expanding this notion of Black personhood, right? This notion that constitutional rights can actually or should actually be proved to firmly attach to Black people and Black body and Black spaces. There's this idea, and I'm going to stop on this so we can get to the audience, but there's this idea, right, in criminal law where someone could be in a high crime neighborhood, right? And it's like the Fourth Amendment just rolls off your back. Now, you can't control where you're born, right? So if I'm born and I'm poor and I'm in the inner city, all of a sudden I have a Fourth Amendment because there's crime around me. There needs to be no reasonable suspicion. My body, the conditions of my birth are now the reasonable suspicion. That is crazy. But if it was anything else, you know, the Supreme Court would say that's too vague. But at the same time, it's not. At the same time, it's very, very.
So this is what happens sometimes because the professor and I sit in a space, and sometimes we hijack meetings just going back and forth. So I don't want to do that tonight. I want to open it up to the audience and see what questions that you have. But believe me, we could do this for a while tonight.
Who's got a question?
We're in a space right now where we are banning books and we're banning people and history. Why?
I mean, that's such a complicated but also simple answer, right? I think that, you know, particularly if we look at our courts, the Supreme Court right now is very conservative, and they allegedly are textualist. Allegedly, they like history. They like white history to an extent. But if you actually have a contested history, if you have a robust kind of view of American history, it's kind of hard to kind of think that our notion of equality right now is actually sustainable or it's true, right? I think that banning history makes it much easier to create a logic that the decisions the court is making right now, the decisions that wayward governors in Florida are making right now, are actually in alignment with the notion of freedom, right? Or alignment with the notion of equal justice under law. And I think the more that people understand, that this is why the 1619 Project is maligned, the more that people understand what actually has happened in history, there's going to be a questioning around the rhetoric of the Constitution, a questioning around the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence as, not W.E. Boys, my goodness, our first, right? The fact that that was written over 130 years ago, and it is still applicable today, tells you all you need to know. And I believe if our children and if ourselves as lawyers who take this seriously actually wield that history, it becomes very hard for a Supreme Court to contest what has actually happened, particularly once Americans have a common grammar and a common set of facts about what has actually transpired. History is a weapon. It can be used for or against you.
When we're looking for the next question from the audience, could you talk a little bit about the center of the law? Because this point here that you're just talking about, the power of language, increasing shared understanding around history, how important is that for us to grab hold and really shape the democracy in a way to really live into what has been promised and the promissory note that's always been coming back as insufficient funds?
Yeah, so here's the issue, right? The Supreme Court has said, and most recently with the Miranda rights, this idea where someone will tell you that you have a right to remain silent and all of these things, that our rights are not self-executing. That is to say that you do not have a right until you prove the right. That means that when you get arrested by an officer, you don't have a right to remain silent until you say, I want to remain silent. I'm exercising my right to remain silent. So the fact you have to speak to be quiet is really interesting, right? And so our other rights operate in the same way. It's a kind of push and pull. And the more the state or the government or state actors are able to push against you, right? Say your right to privacy, this idea of you have privacy in your home. When you go to these websites and you allow certain cookies, they encroach upon it. And that's the new norm. So your expectation of privacy is now lowered. So now you have less privacy, right? That's how all of our constitutional paradigms work. And so until we push against those bounds strongly, those rights begin to disappear. But what happens is, as common folk, as lay folk, we believe we know what the law is. Right? And we go about our everyday life with this assumption of what the law is, when in reality, the courts are having completely different conversation. So here you go, thought you had this First Amendment right to say what you wanted to say and not be penalized by the government. Well, no, you don't, not anymore, right? And that's how it happens. This is almost this dystopian reality where everyday people live in this notion of this was the plain meaning of the law. And then the courts and the legislators of states and the government itself have a completely different meaning, and it's not even explained to us. Right? So before you know it, your own rights have disappeared, right? And they say they did it with your consent. They say they did it with your votes, even though you've been gerrymandering out of having a say.
We have another question from the audience.
So I
feel like I'm behind. Like I have so much to learn. And do you have any, like I downloaded that Baldwin essay to read because I have never read it before and I've read
Yes.
some of his other works, but do you have any other, books that you
Mhm.
think would be great
Yeah.
places?
Really good comprehensive book is Heather McGee, The Sum of Us. Really great book. I would also recommend Imani Perry's South to America. There's been so much misinformation on critical race theory that I would certainly recommend the book Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Formed the Movement, edited by Kimberly Crenshaw. It has all the kind of original text there, but that's a good 1,200, 1,500 page start with those three.
All right, I think we have another question.
Yep.
So my question, and most of my questions to you are usually along the same kind of line, but speaking to your point about when you're in law school, you have this fire,
Mhm.
and then we have to study for the bar,
Mhm.
and then that kind of permeates throughout
Mhm.
like our thinking, and we get into practice and we forget.
Mhm.
So as a law student, how do I maintain that fire? How do I remember the disconnect in the law that you all are teaching us that is steeped in systemic racism
Mhm.
that the black letter law does not connect? How do
Mhm.
I remember that past the bar? And
Mhm.
how do I bring that with me into practice to make the
That's
change
right.
that I want to make now?
You have to remember who you are and where you come from and who your people are, and remain deeply invested in community and deeply vulnerable to community's critiques. Because what happens is oftentimes, and I will speak even for my own self, I came from a very low income community, and become a space. I encourage you to not just stay grounded in the pain and also the genius of your community, but to, as anytime you read a text from law school, read a text from Black Studies. Read a text from the news from your local community, and communities not just in the United States, but across the world, so you understand that the way American democracy and American law is being wielded, and having a particular type of serviceability for subordination. So even as you become experts in the law, you cannot lose your expertise in your own life, right? And so what I did in law school, how I didn't go crazy, is I basically got drunk on Audre Lorde and bell hooks, right? Because they remind us of the ability of the body, right, to keep score in a certain type of way about the truth, and remind you to listen to your educational system. It's telling you that something is wrong, right? And so how do you respond to it? And most times law school people respond to it by swallowing it down or becoming alcoholics. Is also that, sadly, other things. But people swallow that down. Drunk years in school, but also with people that are lawyers and judges and artists and poets and creators. Never allow yourself to be siloed off into the rhetorics and the logics of the law, because you'll lose yourself.
Do we have another question? I should say that sounds like that's also a great tie-in to what you're seeking to accomplish at the Center for Black Life in the Law.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is create a space where people are able to think with and beyond the law, right? Where we can think with our personal experiences and beyond the things we've ever imagined and thought of, right? So my goal is to kind of create a space that is outside the law school community, but adjacent, and outside of our kind of households, but adjacent, and allow us to really think about what is the truth. And not just what is the truth and what is our goals for tomorrow, but if the conditions of the world weren't what they are today, what world would we birth? If the law was of no issue, of no consequence, what world would you birth? What consequences would there be? What ways would you respond to harm, right? Because each of us in this room is a harborer of precedents, right? You get to decide what the law will be next year, in 5 years, in 20 years. You pick up and you make the new legal arguments at the appellate level, at the state level, and so on and so on. But we have to be brave enough to push back and to create that movement, right? Before right now, we didn't read law school. What movement will you make? Will you make the movement, or will you be role sessions? We're in this room right now. How would they imagine justice? And what is your duty to them?
I want to pick up on what you said there about the First Amendment. I mean, when I was commissioner, I was on the losing end of a case, a 2-to-1 decision, which basically said that the First Amendment trumps discrimination laws.
Yeah.
And there are 4 or 5 cases that are circulating around the Supreme Court at this time. What advice would you give the audience, to the legal community that's passionate about discrimination laws, and not having sort of the vision that was foisted upon us by some justices on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court and a lot of our appellate courts have really endorsed the idea of a right to hate, right? And the critical race theorist Mary Matsuda came up with the concept of, which you probably heard, microaggressions, or in other words, words that wound, right? Words that carry historical power and are able to traumatize on the spot. And so what I would say is that law is not the answer. The question is, how do you create beloved communities? How do you create a common knowledge and a common value center that goes on, right? Laws and policy, right? How do we sit with one another and say, I actually don't like you. And that's where you don't like a lot of people. It'd be like that sometimes. But I also see you as human. I also don't want you to hurt. I also believe that you deserve drinkable water. You deserve good air quality. You deserve good food. And I understand that my future is tied up in yours. And what happens also often is we meet each other at the ideological kind of warfare situation, and we don't meet each other at the human piece, right? And we have to get back there. And that isn't to get into this weird thing where people are like, you know, all sides, or, you know, let's just, you agree with this, we disagree, let's meet in the middle. There is no middle to humanity, right? We can hear each other out, but what you won't do is cause indignities to me. So I think we have to be in our, it starts off with one-on-one, starts off with smaller communities, but it also starts off with the policies you have in your school. It starts with the policies you have with your partner and your loved ones, with your parents, right, with the people that you date, and it grows from there. So the question isn't so much, how do we do this with law, discrimination law? But the question is, how do you create a critical love ethic day to day in your household? And how does that sprout out from there? Intentionally, right? How do you talk to the people you supervise? How do you give critiques? How do you respond to pain? Right? Because really, the law is made and proved in our interpersonal interactions, and it bubbles up, not just down.
We've got one more question here.
Hi, Professor.
She wrote that down. Go ahead.
I had to.
It's so much fun seeing judges up here and then getting questions from lawyers that they've appeared, and also seeing students get a chance to ask questions of the professors. It's part of moderating.
What do people in the fundraising community say when they're seeking support for the Center for Black Law?
Yeah, I mean, people say a lot of things. Lord have mercy. With the good stories, the bad stories. No, I think that what people have said when they've, when they've supported us or they've gone out to do fundraising on behalf of us, is they look at the gap, right, in the conversation right now. They understand that very rarely are people having the conversations that we're having. People are oftentimes having on one side a kind of Blue Lives Matter, fraternal order of police conversation. On the other side, people are saying either reform it or burn it all down, right? What we're trying to do is think beyond, right, and with, right? What we're trying to do is be a convening space where all these multiple opinions, experiences, and truth can sit in a room and get just a little bit closer to humanity, right? To get a little bit closer to a solution. And we may not like each other at the solution. We may be arguing and cussing each other out. But as I know from the history of Senate, we're not that bad. People were beating each other with canes and pistols after death in the United States Senate in the beginning, right? But what we're doing right now is battling ideas, right? And what we're also trying to do is create an education for our students and community members alike that most law schools won't allow you to do in a typical bar-tested class. We're trying to get you not to just repeat the law, but think through the law. What is the lie beneath the law, right? What are the motivations of the folks that are writing these opinions? What are the identities of the folks that are affected by these particular law school? You don't even know the race of the folk involved in the case. You don't know their class background, right? We don't even know the stakes. So the question is like, how do we teach our students and our community members to advocate on behalf of ourselves with the kind of contextual truth that's usually been missing? So that's what I try to give.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience? Let me ask you one final question, and then I'll ask the audience to thank you for the wonderful conversation we've had tonight. But I think you kind of answered the question the way you answered that last one. You talk about us running out of time, and you talked tonight about us being tied in a mutual destiny. What impacts one impacts the other, from Dr. King's speech. This idea that democracy can never truly exist until reparations, until Black people have been made whole. Are we running out of time, or is this idea of our democracy, can it really withstand this idea of, as you said, hundreds of
democracy the mythology of our democracy, the American daydream, right, that is experienced as a nightmare by many, is revealing itself, right? I think that, to your point, you can't have chattel slavery and have a democracy. You can't have forcibly remove peoples from their lands and genocides and call it democracy, right? You can't have xenophobia and homophobia and call it a democracy. And so I think what we're reckoning with right now is that we've never had a democracy, right? What we're pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And now people are starting to speak up about their pain. So now we're getting into the business of actually making a democracy. And it's very painful. And some people are losing power and it's scaring the hell out of them. Now is a time where we're all trying to be measured on a type of meritocracy where everybody got to work. And some people have had to work for their own existence 5 times as fast as everybody else, and other folks haven't. So now we're getting into a space where labor is required, where truth-telling is required, where accountability is required, and it's causing an identity crisis, and it's causing a rupture. And what I think it is we're deciding whether we're going to birth this thing of democracy or whether we're going to abort it.
So on behalf of the Minnesota Humanities Center, I want to thank you tonight. On behalf of our good friends Tane Danger and the folks here at the Westminster, I also want to thank you. And then I'm very proud to be a member of the board of Maple, to be able to host you tonight as part of our celebration on Black History Month. Thank you so much, my friend.
I echo the thanks. I feel like I got a lesson and I've got some work to do. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Kevin Lindsay. And thank you, our virtual audience and the people that are here today. We've got a treat. So one thing that we are trying to do are collaborations, right? Thought leaders, folks that have something to say. We invite you to come back to Westminster in May 20th, when we are going to have Dr. Cornell West join us. It's a collaboration. It's our brand now. And it's going to be a collaboration between Westminster, Minnesota Humanities Center, and Maple. And so look for an invitation. We're going to eat. I'm hungry. And I hope you're hungry too. And so please join us in the hallway. We are going to have Soul Bowl. We're going to celebrate Black History Month today and every day. So thank you.